This is the second Levelling Up Democracy event. We're delighted to have Mark Drakeford joining us. The previous Levelling Up Democracy event was the Andy Burnham one. There is information about all the events and previous recordings are all available on the Labour for a New Democracy website. My colleagues should be able to post that into the chat. This evening's meeting will run until 7 o'clock. We will be ending promptly at 7. And we're very delighted to have so many people on the call. You will notice that you're all on mute. That is because there are so many of you. You will have the opportunity to ask questions later though. When you signed up to the event, there was a link on the sign up to AHA slides. We'll also drop that in the chat too if you haven't been able to sign up for that. But you will be able to post your questions. You'll also be able to vote up other questions. What I would say though, when you sign into our AHA slides, please make sure that your name matches the name you have on the screen. Otherwise we won't be able to find you to let you ask your question. If you've got any issues with getting into AHA slides, then you can pop a question in chat, but it's very easy to miss that way. So it would be much, much better if you can use the app for it. We, as a campaign, we represent the majority of Labour Party members, CLPs and affiliated trade unions who are committed to proportional representation for general elections in Westminster. You can find out all the information about the campaign on the Labour for a New Democracy website. And if you are tweeting during this event, please can you use the hashtag Labour4PR, that's the digit 4. And so do tweet about the event if you're interested in what you're hearing. So I am delighted to introduce to you all Mark Drakeford. He's the First Minister for Wales. He has been the leader of Welsh Labour since 2018. He has previously served in the Welsh Government as Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Minister for Health and Social Services, and he was first elected as a member of the Senedd for Cardiff West in 2011. Before entering politics, Mark was also a professor at Cardiff University. And we also discovered this weekend, whilst at Tolpuddle, we were speaking to one of your ex-colleagues who told us about your time in probation services and how you were working with NAPO. NAPO, the Probation Services Union, have really strong policy in favour of PR and have done for a very long time. So I don't need to tell Mark that, but it might be of interest to some others on the call. Tonight we're going to be talking about proportional representation. Mark's going to bring to us his expertise, given that Wales already uses a proportional system. As a campaign, Labour for a New Democracy are not promoting any specific system of proportional representation, although we may have a discussion about, what is used in Wales. It may come up. We want to hear about how things work in Wales. We want to hear about how the Welsh system works in comparison to Westminster, and how proportional representation is serving Wales a lot better than first past the post is serving Westminster and the rest of the UK, and not Scotland, obviously. But yeah, so we will come on to all of that a bit later. But I think probably the first and most important question that our members on the call would like to hear is, why, Mark, in principle, do you support the idea that the share of seats a party wins should be represented, by the share of votes the party wins should be represented by the seats in the Parliament that they're sitting in? Essentially, why do you support proportional representation?
Well, I think why in principle is because of the principle. It just is a principle for me that the votes that people cast for different political parties should be broadly reflected in the result of those votes cast. That seems to me to be a pretty basic democratic principle. And I'm an old lag, really, in all of this, thinking of my probation days, because, I have been on Labour Party platforms arguing for proportional representation since the 1980s. And one of the things that I think has become more important in the debate for me, and one of the principles that reaffirms me in my beliefs, is that we have seen in Wales how corrosive it is to democracy if there is not a fighting chance that the votes that you cast will result in the government that you get. And that argument has become easier to win in Wales in the 2020s than it was in the 1980s. In the 1980s, people who voted Labour in Wales could see that from 1945 to 1979, there was a more or less 50-50 chance that if you voted Labour, you ended up with a Labour government. So, your vote had a fighting chance of counting and getting you the government that you wanted. Since 1979, we've had, essentially 10 years of Labour and 30 years of the Tories over that period. And in November this year, we will celebrate in Wales the centenary of Labour winning a majority of seats in a general election. It happened first in November 1922, and we've never not done it since. So, election after election after election, Labour wins in Wales, but the people who vote Labour don't get a government and are beginning to lose faith in a possibility that their votes will deliver them a Labour government. And, had we had a different electoral system, I'm quite sure that corrosive impact of the current system would have not taken place. So there we are. There are two basic reasons: because it is the right thing to do, that people should get the representation they vote for, and secondly, that without it, in somewhere like Wales, people's underlying confidence in the democratic system is being chipped away at.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's a point we hear time and time again. That's sort of, and how it makes the electorate feel, and how people become so dissatisfied. And I mean, we're really seeing that in the UK at the moment. I'd like to expand a little bit on that, and sort of ask you what you think the main issues with UK democracy are. When you look at Westminster, and you sort of touched on that when you've said about how Wales has sort of for just about 100 years have voted in a Labour majority in Wales, yet they're not seeing that represented in Westminster. What sort of, I feel it can have quite a toxic effect on how the electorate are and how the electorate feel about politics. And I wonder if you care to expand on that a little bit and share your thoughts on it.
Well, I think the deepest outcrop of that, from a Welsh perspective, has to be inequality. The United Kingdom was the most equal country in Europe in 1976. The share of the national economy that went to labour rather than to capital was greatest in 1976. And then the impact of the IMF crisis in those final years of a Labour government, and then the very deliberate recourse to stoking up inequality, because that is what neoliberalism relies on, has set us on a very, very different path since then. The Labour governments of the years after 1997 acted heroically to slow the pace of inequality, and in some instances to even manage to reverse a bit of it. But that's a small island in that long sea of conservative governments. That means that we are yet again the most unequal country almost in the whole of Europe, and inequality is by itself so destructive of the things that make people's lives worth living. You will all know all of this, of course. That more equal societies enjoy better health, they enjoy better economic outcomes, and they bind people together in a way that sharply unequal societies can never do. So if there was a single thing that I think you could say the United Kingdom would have navigated very differently had we had a different electoral system to support it, I don't think we would be that sharply unequal society that we see today, and where those inequalities manifest themselves in almost every aspect of life. The pandemic in Wales cruelly exposed some of those health inequalities. Those people who suffered the most were the people who had the least in the first place. And if there was anything a Labour government would wish to grapple with, surely it would be to create a society in which the gap between those who don't have enough and those who have more than they will ever know what to do with would be narrowed, and that will be to the benefit of us all. We need an electoral system that allows us the opportunity to do that.
Thank you. That's it's really interesting when you're talking about like inequality, and you're saying that we were, you know, sort of the most equal country in 1976. 1976 doesn't feel like a hugely long time ago, you know, sort of on the grand scheme of things. And it's really, you know, it can make people feel really hopeless that we've gone so far backwards in such a relatively short period of time. It's interesting to hear you talk about inequality. I mean, Andy Burnham, who did our previous event, he told us that the UK is such an unequal country in part because it's hardwired for inequality, and that we need a complete rewiring of Britain's political system. And that, I mean, it's the same kind of theme, that we're given this inequality on the basis of an electoral system that really allows for it. And you also talked about, you know, sort of Wales and the pandemic, and I mean, you really have to be commended on the fact that, you know, sort of Wales's response to the pandemic was, you know, hugely different to the rest of the UK's response, and it really did show, you know, what a socialist government in power and Labour government in power can do, and the difference that can be made. I'd like to touch a little bit on the wider Labour movement, and specifically trade unions. There's been a lot of shift in trade unions. You're already very much aware that more and more unions are coming on board. And most recently, Unison came out strongly in favour of PR at their delegates conference, and then strengthened that support for PR at their labelling conference. At Welsh Labour conference, I shared a panel with Shivana Taj, and it was great to hear where Welsh TUC are generally on political reform, and how the effect it's going to have on unions, and obviously the reforms in Wales. I mean, how do you see the wider Labour movement in relation to proportional representation in Wales? Does the feeling within Welsh unions kind of echo the rest of the UK shift in, you know, sort of support for proportional representation? I mean, are they already ahead of the rest of the UK in their support? It'd be interesting to hear.
Well, two things really. One is there's been an enormous sea change in attitudes in Wales. You know, to get PR into the Assembly, as it then was in 1999, was a real battle, and it took an awful lot of heavy lifting to make sure we had a system that, to the extent that it does, creates a proportional outcome. But when we had our special conference only a couple of weeks ago to deepen the radical nature of the system in Wales, it was just overwhelmingly passed in our conference. In the union section, we won by 2 votes to 1, 66 to 33, and in the constituency section, we won 84%. Of the constituency votes were in favour of reform. And in the union section, that was really led by Unite and by Unison, together with a number of other smaller unions, and, you know, with influential arguments to make. So I think you see a really big change there. You know, the trade unions have been supporters of this sort of reform in Wales previously, but maybe slightly against the grain of their UK positions, whereas now, you know, they are consistent with those UK positions, so reinforced and strengthened in all of that. And, you know, our aim has always been to be a government, not just of the Labour Party, but of the Labour movement in Wales. We have a social partnership model, which means that our trade union colleagues are round the table with us, with employers as well, when we face those really, really challenging decisions. And it's hard work, social partnership. You know, these are challenging and difficult conversations as you try to find the common ground around which you can all gather. But our trade union colleagues have, you know, demonstrated time and time again that they are both committed to it, and of course, as negotiators, very skilled at it as well.
That's excellent to hear. That's really great to hear. Can I just remind everybody on the call that if you want to ask a question, do get it in the AHA slides, and do feel free to put your questions forward now and have a look at the questions and vote them up. I know Sam's put some information in the chat about how you vote those questions up as well. So yeah, go ahead and ask some questions. Mark, you have spoken in the past about how first past the post feeds the fishers that threaten to prise the UK apart by forcing unrepresentative governments. And they force those unrepresentative governments on Wales and Scotland and other parts of the UK, and Northern Ireland as well, none of which tend to vote Conservative. You've already touched on this evening on this call. I think a recent example of this in the UK government would be when the UK government announcing that it would unilaterally revoke devolved legislation that protects trade unions in Wales. I don't know whether that policy will outlive Boris Johnson's career. I certainly hope not. But can you say a little bit about this and why you think first past the post is putting a strain on the unions more generally?
Well, look, my starting point has always been I'm a believer in the union. I think the union is better off for having Wales in it, and that Wales is better off for being in the union. So I want the union to succeed. I think only Labour can save the union. I think the union is under greater threat today than at any time in my political lifetime. And that unless we can put a compelling case in front of people in Scotland and in Wales as to why they should choose to be part of the union will remain under considerable threat. And the last gasp of the Johnson government threatening to overturn trade union legislation democratically passed through the Senedd, where the Solicitor General of the UK government at the time said it was within our powers to pass that legislation. That sort of dreadful muscular unionism, as it's called, is just vindictive, both in its attempt to roll back the powers of a devolved legislature, but also its attack on trade unionism. So it's little surprise that those things come together. And this is the first time in the history of devolution, a very short history of devolution, that we have faced a Conservative government with a working majority. And it's been a very salutary experience, because for the first time we have faced a government which is hostile to devolution. Tony Blair's greatest mistake, that's what Johnson told his own MPs. We should listen to him occasionally, because sometimes he even manages to tell the truth. And he was telling the truth there from his own perspective, and he's acted on that basis ever since, taking away powers, taking away money. And what we've learned is that the next Labour government will have to act to entrench devolution, to put it on a basis that cannot be vulnerable to the temporary occupation of power by a government of the Johnson sort. We've worked with previous UK Conservative governments. We don't agree with them, of course, but the relationship with a Mrs. May-led government, for all that I disagree with her on so much, but it did have an underlying sense of respect. And you'll see that shortly before she stopped being Prime Minister, she gave a lecture in Edinburgh in which she described the United Kingdom as a voluntary association of four nations, not one in which one part of it can think that its job is to boss everybody else around. Now, it is remarkable that we have a union in which governments in all four countries are headed by different political parties. And what we don't have is a set of institutional arrangements that allow that to succeed. It certainly can't succeed by just the one feeling that it has a trump card that it can always play that will blot out the other three. So we need a constitutional settlement that allows the United Kingdom to succeed, to create a union of social solidarity in which the case for the United Kingdom is compelling enough that people will want to be part of it, not because they feel they are being forced to be part of it. And you need an electoral system that allows that to happen as well.
It's incredibly refreshing to hear you talking about the UK in such a manner. So often we hear people in politics, particularly in certain parties, talking about, you know, how they, you know, sort of would do onto the UK, not looking at, you know, sort of, and the UK electorate as well, and not really looking at the fact that, you know, sort of people in other parts of the union should be given some autonomy over, you know, the way they vote, the decisions they make, and handing back power to the people. And essentially that's what sort of devolution is all about. But it's really refreshing to hear you talk about it from that sort of perspective. From that, I'd like to turn a little bit to Welsh democracy and the evolving shape and status of the Senedd. You talked a little bit about the reforms. The Welsh Assembly is now recognised as the national parliament, and Senedd reform is something that's been talked about for many years, but it seems to finally be making progress. I think a lot of this is because, you know, you are at the helm and you've championed it, and it's great to have somebody champion, you know, the reforms that need to happen, not just within Wales, but the reforms that we need across the whole of the UK. Can you tell us about a little bit more about the journey that Welsh democracy has been on? I know you've already touched on it a little bit, but it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about what's happened since the start of devolution.
So the birth of devolution in Wales was a difficult one. We didn't have the same preparation as had been achieved in Scotland, and the referendum that secured devolution was won by a whisker here in Wales. So the job of the early days of the Assembly, as it was to establish itself, to make it felt as a democratic institution. And, you know, that was the job, in a way, of one of my predecessors and mentor, Rodri Morgan, who, you know, in 10 years managed to turn that very fragile result into an enormous endorsement in a second referendum for primary law-making powers in Wales. And that was a remarkable journey in just 10 years. You know, there were a number of reasons why that was achieved, but it was mostly achieved, I think, by just making the Senedd a place where people in Wales felt they could go when they had something that they wanted to have discussed and debated and decided. That sense of decisions being, you know, within the grasp of the people to whom those decisions mattered the most. But throughout that journey, we went from being, you know, an organisation, an institution with very little power. We genuinely did debate the smaller Egyptian potato water in the first year of the Senedd, to an institution that now is a full lawmaking institution that has fiscal powers as well as legislative powers, that makes decisions over about £17 billion of expenditure on behalf of Welsh citizens. And despite that enormous change, we still have 60 members that we started with. And it simply is not enough to be able to discharge the responsibilities that the Senedd holds. And, you know, the balance between the executive and the legislature is not in the right place either. We need, you know, a better scrutiny capacity to be able to make up for the fact that we are a unicameral legislature. There's no second chamber. There's no chance to put things right if you get them wrong in the first chamber, and so on. So the reform of the Senedd was, as you said, prefaced in a report that was done by Lord Ivor Richard, who had been Labour's leader in the House of Lords in the first Blair government, and of course, you know, somebody from Ammanford in South Wales. He did a review of the first Senedd term and said then that we needed more Senedd members and a different set of arrangements in order to go on, as he said, making a success of devolution. His was not a deficit conclusion. He didn't say because things are wrong, you need to do these things to put them right. He said because things are going well, you need to underpin what's going well with the tools you need to go on making a success. Now, it's been very hard to bring that about. You need a 2/3 majority on the floor of our Senedd to change the current system. And, you know, that's a fragile coalition. You've got to bring a lot of people with you in it. And I spent a lot of my time saying to members of my party that we all had to be prepared to be half a loafers in this debate. If any of us thought we were going to get the whole of a loaf, we were going to be disappointed, because we had to work with other people, and you had to be prepared to settle for half a loaf in that, because half a loaf was an awful lot better than no change at all. And those were the propositions that I said were powerfully endorsed in our recall conference, were propositions to extend the membership of the Senedd from 60 to 97 members, to change the electoral system to a list system based on dehont, and to entrench the gains that we have made in gender equality. I lead a group that has 18 women and 12 men, I think, at the last count. My cabinet has more women in it than men as well. We want to make sure that can't slip backwards, and to entrench that in the way that the electoral system will deliver for people of Wales in the future, and allow us to make further inroads in other forms of equality where we haven't succeeded to the same extent that we have on gender. So those were the propositions that were in front of our conference. They were powerfully endorsed. We will now have to put a piece of legislation in front of the Senedd to allow all that to happen for 2026, when the next Senedd elections will take place.
Well, let's hoping that they go through, and we're taking that half a loaf step forward. It's really interesting to hear you talk about, sort of the reform, and it's also it's quite interesting because when you talk to people who maybe aren't quite up to speed with, the fact that the Senedd is that there is talk of reform and it's being looked at, I think it would be quite easy for people to think that reform would be looking at maybe switching back to first past the post, but actually that was never ever on the cards. It was always about tweaking proportional representation to make it more proportional still. And you also see that kind of echoed where they've had a move to proportional representation in other countries like New Zealand, where they then have a referendum on whether people want to move back to first past the post, and they don't. People are much more satisfied with the voting system when you move over to proportional representation, and we feel really strongly that if we can get this through the UK, that the UK won't look back, as a whole, and Westminster won't look back, because the electorate are more satisfied under a proportional system. We've got examples all around the world where Labour parties flourish under proportional systems, from New Zealand to Germany to Portugal, and of course Wales. Yet in countries that don't have proportional representation, there is that sort of institutional reluctance to embrace PR amongst parties of the left. Why do you think that is? And what would you say to a Labour MP to bring them on board?
Well, I would simply point to the basic facts of how the current system delivers year after year, election after election, Tory governments on a minority of the votes cast, and just how corrosive that is, and just how undermining that is. I find it very difficult to see the world through the eyes of a Labour MP who argues for the status quo that keeps them in opposition for 30 of the last 40 years. How come this is a system that works for Labour? I absolutely cannot see it at all. Well, part of what people are afraid of, I think, is the fact that if you have a proportional system, you do have to work with others. And we've had Labour governments consistently since 1999, but we've never won more than half the seats. Our high watermark is 30 seats, which is what we have currently. On 30 seats, you cannot pass a budget. On 30 seats, you cannot pass legislation. You have to find support elsewhere on the floor of the Senedd for what you want to do. And, it has always been possible to create a progressive coalition, sometimes in a coalition, sometimes in an arrangements where you have to create that coalition issue by issue. But I think that has been a huge strength for us, to demonstrate that as Labour we are able to do that, that there are people in other parts of the political spectrum who not on everything, of course not. We have big differences. For example, with Plaid Cymru, who we currently have an arrangement with. But on a range of very important issues, there is a progressive consensus that you can craft. And actually, you know, people out there like to see people working together. They don't have the same tribal, impossibility of doing so. And we've demonstrated for, what will be a quarter of a century by the end of the Senate term that you can do that successfully and deliver on radical reforms. And actually, I don't think we could get the radical reforms through the Senate on 30 votes. You know, we will reform the Senate itself. We will reform the school day and the school year. We will reform the council tax in Wales. All of those, whenever you want to change things, you run into the forces of reaction and the forces who want to protect the status quo. You need coalitions of interest across parties to challenge those entrenched positions. And I think that's what we've been able to demonstrate that Labour-led governments are able to do.
Yeah, and isn't it wonderful to see the kind of contrast between the coalition government that happens in Wales and, sort of Westminster's disproportionate parliament that, has that overall power. And I think it's, you look to the rest of the world and you look at consensus politics, and the point that you make that people really like to see politicians working together. I mean, one of our people on the call, Pat, my namesake, Pat Osborne, has put that it's proper grown-up politics. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at it. Consensus politics is definitely what the electorate like to see. And it's an important point to remember that, just because some of us within politics may be quite tribal, those who are outside of it don't think in the same tribal ways at all. And some of us who are in politics aren't tribal either. And it's definitely, when you see the contrast between Westminster and Wales, it's you really are showing us how consensus politics can work.
Just to say again, though, consensus politics is hard work. It is
Without
not holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Hours and hours of talking has to go into crafting consensus and finding a way in which you can work with other people. It is sapping in terms of the amount of time and effort that it takes. But it does have pluses as well. By the time you announce something publicly, you have already had to test that idea, sometimes time after time with another political party. You've got to have been able to answer the hard questions about why you are doing it in the way you are doing and all of that. That internal challenge actually, I think, produces better policy. But you do have to invest a lot in it.
That's a hugely valid point. And it kind of, you make the point that, your coalitions are, or your consensus politics is doing the kind of scrutiny that the electorate wants to see. Who doesn't want scrutiny when putting through laws and bills that are going to affect us as the electorate? So it's, whilst I do appreciate it's hard work, it's, and of course it is, but I think it's the good that comes out of that. It's really important to recognise that, isn't it? Thank you, Mark, for answering those questions. We're going to hand over to Q&A from our audience now. We've got a few questions that have come through already. I think the first person we have got lined up should be Elaine. I'm hoping Elaine should be unmuted or shall shortly be unmuted to ask her question. That's Elaine Moore, if that's helpful.
Noswaith dda.
Noswaith dda, Elaine.
Yeah, diolch yn fawr am fod ein prif weinidog, Mark. I was just saying thank you to Mark for being our first minister. It's fantastic. I want you to tell us a little bit more about the topic you were talking about right at the end there. What are the challenges, given that PR is likely to lead here in Wales to more coalition-style governments in the Senedd, because people won't be forced to vote against someone to block them in their constituency, but can vote for whomever they wish. How do you envisage the challenges and in particular the benefits in the future of that type of coalition working?
Well, Elaine, look, thank you very much. Here are three ingredients for me for successful coalition building. First of all, it has to begin with policy. it cannot begin with a set of cobbled together political arrangements where you then decide what it is you've got together to do. You have to start with a policy programme, and that can take time and a lot of hammering out and a lot of midnight oil to get an agreement on what it is that you are cooperating to achieve. So that's the first thing you have to have. Then you have to have political arrangements to underpin that, particularly political arrangements that allow you to navigate the difficult days. What happens when things that you haven't anticipated happen? What happens when something that you thought was going to happen goes off the rails, and so on? You need a set of written down arrangements that says this is how we will, manage that difficult position. So I think those two things are key. And here's my third, which is a very different sort of answer. But in my experience, women are critical to coalition building. So I don't sound too reductionist about it, but in my experience, women come through the door looking for common ground, and sometimes men come through the door looking to beat their chest and point out where things are different. I think there is a fair chance that the future of politics in Wales, in the way that we've constructed them, will see a greater prominence for women leaders in our political system, because these are huge generalizations. I know many men who are, utterly consensus. Dominic and I voted a few women who are not shy in pointing out differences. But to make that huge generalization, I think that that it will give a different level of prominence to people who come through the door looking to find ways to create common ground.
That's excellent, thank you. It's nice to hear. I mean, I know we don't do sweeping generalizations, but it is nice to hear, your sort of real person experiences and how you're seeing it. And it's sometimes these start points of generalizations do actually need to sort of a bit more sort of research and change. And so yeah, that's really interesting. And it'd be good to see some future female leaders. It's always good to see. Our next question is from Sandy Martin. I'm hoping Sandy is just about ready. There we are. Go ahead, Sandy.
Hi, Karen. Yes. Mark, there's been a great deal of discussion within the Labour Party recently about devolution. And Andy Burnham has argued recently that further devolution won't work properly unless it's accompanied by PR. Do you think there are limits to what devolution can achieve if it's not accompanied with a PR system?
Well, my own belief is that these things do go hand in hand. To achieve the one, you need the other. But by itself, PR, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to achieve a successful future for the United Kingdom. So it has to go alongside other radical reforms, of which, to my mind, the most fundamental is this. The Tories, Johnson still attempts to run the United Kingdom as though this were 1974. And we were, a unitary state, and where Parliament is sovereign, and it ekes out tiny bits of sovereignty to other democratic bodies and can pull it back again the minute it doesn't like what it sees going on. Well, my belief is that de facto, if not de jure, sovereignty is already dispersed across the United Kingdom. In theory, a UK government could legislate to outlaw the teaching of Welsh in Welsh schools. But in practice, that is absolutely impossible to imagine. So actually, de facto, sovereignty over those issues is already located in the component parts of the United Kingdom. And that's how we should construct a future United Kingdom. recognising that sovereignty now rests in the 4 parliaments, and that we choose to pull it back together again for those common purposes which we do better at the UK level. So that's turning the whole thing, on its head. Proportional forms of election in different parts of the UK support that very strongly, but unless you have both elements and some others with it, then the peril that the United Kingdom faces doesn't, I think, go away.
Yeah, that's it's interesting to hear that, sort of we tend to hear that, sort of, I don't think there's anybody in the democracy sector that thinks that proportional representation would fix everything, or anything alone. It would be a start point. And I think that's really important to remember. And I think it's important to remember that, whilst it could be introduced as a standalone policy, it's definitely going to lead to better things. Our next question comes from Vicky Seddon. Vicky, are you able to unmute? Are you there, Vicky? I can clearly see you're on the call because you're in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I was lovely to have Mark here, and I have a huge amount of respect for what Mark and the Labour Party are doing in Wales, and I just hope that the experience there, we can learn from that in the rest of the UK. So thank you very much, Mark. The question I wanted to ask you was about female representation in your assembly. Labour in Westminster, there are now equal numbers of male and female Labour MPs, because they work really hard to get all women shortlists and make sure that the electorate is presented with female Labour candidates. And that's fantastic, and I'm really upset that that's not celebrated by the Labour Party. What I'd like to know, because I don't know, is how are you managing that in Wales? Are you using the same processes, and are you having the same kind of success as Labour is having in Westminster?
So twinning was the foundation stone of gender equality at the Senate for the Labour Party, and we have had since the beginning more women than men in our successive Labour groups. I think the strongest group we had in one election, we had 19 women and 11 men in the Labour group, and we've had 17 and 13, and we've had 18 and 20 and 12 and so on, but it's always hovered around the same sort of numbers, and twinning was the way in which that was achieved. Hugely controversial in its day, but hugely successful in delivering the outcome. And that is so much against the history of the Labour Party in Wales, where a Labour woman MP was a very rare commodity for most of that 100 years. Senate very different, and the new system that we will hopefully introduce for 2026 will entrench that still further by making these things legally watertight, rather than just left to the policies of individual parties. And we have consensus amongst 3 of the 4 parties on the floor of the Senate to put the force of law behind that gender equality agenda.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a question from David Westwood about trust in politics. David, are you able to unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, Mark. Trust in politics is at an all-time low. It's sometimes suggested that Lord's reform, devolution, or even a change of government could repair that. Do you think it's possible to renew faith in Westminster without changing the electoral system?
Well, for me, it goes a bit like this, really. Socialism is what will restore faith in democracy, because the neoliberal ideology is inevitably a low trust set of relationships. It tells voters to suspect other people. It says, watch out for doctors. They're not in it for the, they're not in it for you. They're in it for themselves. Don't trust teachers. They're interested in what's good for teachers, not what's good for students. That is absolutely at the centre of a neoliberal way of thinking about the world. So it's predicated on low trust relationships. It doesn't work unless you persuade people not to trust other people. An equality-driven agenda teaches you that what matters to you is what matters to people who live in the same street as you, in the same town as you. The things that you want in your life are the things they want in their lives. So the things that unite you are much more powerful than the things that divide you, and that inevitably creates high trust relationships. And our conduct of the pandemic was absolutely aimed at trying to create high trust relationships between the government and the people in Wales. So I would go out and do my weekly press conferences. What I would try to do as best I could was to share with everybody else the information that I had and my cabinet colleagues had, and to say to people, look, this is what we think we are seeing, and this is what we think we now need to do about it. Now, you can disagree with the second part of that, but you will know as much as I know. And I think that sense of letting people into the room so that you share with them all the things that you have, and then say to them, you may not agree, but at least you can see now why we came to the conclusion we came to, was all about trying to create high trust relationships. I think a voting system in which people know that what they vote for is what they will get, and as Elaine said, in which you vote positively for what you want rather than to prevent what you don't want. I think that's another fundamental building block in creating those high trust relationships.
How wonderfully refreshing to be talking about trust and relationships in politics, and that link between being able to vote where your vote counts. It's just hugely refreshing to hear. I've got a question from Susan Lennon now, and then we've got one further question. So can I ask if you can try and keep your questions brief, then we can probably squeeze one more in after. But Susan, you should be able to unmute now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous. Sorry, I've got my headphones off. It's partly two questions. One, hello, Mark, by the way. Do you think our government is behind the times and antiquated and should be updated to the 21st century? And do you think that disabled people should be more so represented? As I believe there's only 5 in Parliament that I found out, and perhaps we should have more disabled people to represent the high proportion of disabled people that we have in the UK.
Look, thank you very much for both of those questions. Well, I absolutely do think we have the most antiquated system of government you can imagine. I get so frustrated, really, at the way in which things that belong in the 19th century are somehow curated as though they tell us what it means to be part of Britain, whereas to me it tells you everything that's wrong with contemporary Britain, that it refuses to let go of those sorts of things. And very interestingly, as I would go around to constituency parties talking about Senedd reform and talking about us wanting to entrench gender equality, the argument for other forms of equality, for Black and Asian minority representation, but disability representation as well, was very powerfully made in a number of those meetings. And for me personally, that is something that I am very determined that we will work hard at in the Labour Party, to make sure that with the extra members we will have and the system we will have, that we are able to put people in those positions on the lists that will elect members with a prominence that they need in order to make sure we have that diversity of experience genuinely represented. A Senedd that represents Wales because it looks like Wales. And that obviously means people with disabilities alongside others.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. We've got the final question we've got comes from Rick. I Rick Gale, I wonder if you can unmute yourself now, Rick, and ask your question. Sorry, can you hear the seagulls outside? They're very loud this evening. Apologies for the background noise.
Right.
Rick, have you managed to get there?
I think I've unmuted myself now. Yeah, I wasn't allowed to start with. Just wanted to say thank you, Mark, for coming along to talk to us this evening, because it's been a really fascinating discussion. Once upon a time, I lived in Wales, but it was before devolution. And now I live in another part of the UK. I live in the far southwest, but frankly, it feels just as distant from Westminster as Wales ever did. So bearing that in mind, and something you said earlier on about the voluntary union of the nations of the UK. I wondered if you could just give us a few thoughts about whether or not there are lessons from Welsh devolution that we can apply to the English regions, and what the constitutional advantages or limits to further devolution within the regions of the UK might be. Because one of the things that's very clear is that this the partnership of the Union is an unequal partnership. England is much bigger economically and in population terms than the other nations. So I wondered if you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, look, thank you very much, Rick. And currently, in some ways, we've left the biggest question of all to the very end. You know, the English question, as we call it. So we will not construct a United Kingdom of the sort that I think people would want to belong to, without tackling the issue of, you know, democratic structures within England as well. I never come at this from a perspective of saying, here are lessons that other people should learn from Wales. There are experiences that we have in Wales that we are very happy to share with other people to see whether there is anything useful in that they would find that they could apply in their own circumstances. But it's not a sort of lessons to be learned approach that I think works. I would very much hope that the Gordon Brown report will give us some good advice on how we can find ways of devolving power and decision making and funding and everything else that goes with it, not just to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but to English regions as well. And then, you know, to have a conversation about the things that we would all identify as the things you would want to pull back to be discharged at a UK level. And, you know, I have my own list. It's not the same list as some of my Labour colleagues in Wales, even. So I would put, you know, foreign affairs, defence, macroeconomics, and social security on my list of things. Not everybody puts social security on the list in Wales these days, but for me, social security is an engine that a Labour government needs to use in order to redistribute, you know, incomes and wealth from parts of the UK that has a lot of it to places that don't. But, you know, I'm struggling really to go much beyond that. I think more or less everything else is best decided at a level closer to the people who are directly affected by those decisions. And, you know, there's a proper debate to be had, I think, as to those purposes for which we would choose to pool our sovereignty between the nations, but also, you know, across the regions as well. And by the way, you know, there are parts of Wales that feel remote from Cardiff, just as there are parts of England that feel remote from Westminster. You know, these are common challenges, really, to go on making people feel that their voice can be effectively heard and influential. And, you know, everything we've been talking about tonight in terms of democratic systems is part of allowing those gaps to be filled.
Thanks, Mark. That's a really great point to sort of wrap up on. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add as a final takeaway thought for us?
Well, only the urgency of it all. You know, I think that's what I feel it's so hard to inject into this conversation. You know, at least with a current disposition. You know, Northern Ireland, you know, a case of its own with, you know, complex our history is being played out there. So Northern Ireland doesn't come to the table often very well equipped to lead these sort of conversations. A Scottish government that, whether we agree with it or not, has a mandate, as it would see it, to take Scotland out of the Union, and will hold a referendum next year on that prospect. And an English government that just is unprepared, simply unprepared to put the effort and the energy into creating a different prospectus for the United Kingdom. So if there was any final thought that I would want to leave people with is, we've debated lots of these things for a long time inside the Labour Party, but now these things are absolutely urgent. If we're not careful, in as short a period as 3 years' time, we could be looking back at this and saying it's all too late to put it right.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been really wonderful to hear you speak, and you've just made so many interesting points. I'm sure everybody's walking away from this thinking, I mean, someone's put in the comments already that he wants to move to Wales, and I think he's probably not the only one. Following on from your comments about urgency, we hear you on that, 1000%. I'm sure lots of people on this call are feeling the urgency as well. What I would ask everyone on this call, if you are able to, please put a motion to your CLP. This is the year it has to pass at conference. We have to get this motion on the conference floor. And in order to do that, we need motions going up from CLPs. So if you are a Labour Party member and you haven't already put a motion to your CLP, please do if you still can. The motion is available on the website. There should be a link to it going into the chat. If your CLP has already selected a motion, then get in touch with your delegates, get them to sign up to the campaign, talk to them about why PR matters to you. Everything we can do to get this on the conference, on the conference floor, debated and passed at conferences, that's taking us in the right direction. The only other thing I'd like to do is remind you that we have a, I won't remind you because you don't know about it yet. We have a pre-conference event to give us all the information about conference, give us all the information that delegates will need to know, anyone who's going as a visitor or a volunteer, or anyone who knows anyone who's going to conference. And that's going to be at 7 p.m. on the 7th of September. So get that date in your diaries and do join us for that. And so thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Thank you, Mark. You have been absolutely fantastic.